Okay, we'll make a start for this afternoon. So hello and welcome to the next in our line of SERA Connects events. My name is Angela Japp, not Nicola Cars, which is coming up underneath my face. I am the Vice President of SERA. I am stepping in this afternoon for Nicola, who's not able to be here. So this is the 8th in our series of online Connects events, and we're delighted to welcome you. The event this afternoon is from the Early Years Network, and what I'll be doing is handing over to Elizabeth Black, who's chairing this afternoon's session. So Elizabeth, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Angela, for the introduction, and thank you to SERA for inviting the Early Years Network to participate in the SERA Connects programme this summer. We're really pleased to be here today. I'm Elizabeth. I'm one of the Early Years Network co-conveners and co-host for the session. We're really pleased that the event has been fully sold out today, and we've had a brilliant response. So just to remind everybody, if you can make sure that your microphones are mute and that you turn off your camera unless you're speaking to support access for everybody. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you'll find the toolbar down at the bottom of the screen with those functions. We're also going to be using the chat feature for questions during the discussion and at the end of the presentations. And my fellow network convener, Shaddai, will be monitoring the chat so that he can respond as well to any questions that come up. Our session today is focused on transitions, the idea of moving in, moving on, and moving up. This is an area that's always topical, but more so than ever under the current conditions. We have 3 speakers today who are going to briefly present their recent work around aspects of transitions. First, we'll have Dr. Marion joining us from Education Scotland, who will introduce her research on starting school, linking this to the Realising the Ambition framework for transitions. Then we'll have Emeritus Professor Aline-Wendy of the University of Strathclyde, who will present an integrative model for transitions throughout education, 3 to 18 years, and that draws on her longitudinal study. And our final presenter will be Kathleen, Quality Improvement Manager with the Northern Alliance, who will share work that led to the development of the Northern Alliance's COVID-19 transitions framework. So these presenters are going to speak briefly and share some slides, and after those presentations, there'll be an opportunity for questions for the presenters and an open discussion between participants as well. So without further ado, I'll let Marion take over and start with her presentation.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me, Elizabeth?
Yep, that's fine, Marion, I can hear you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Elizabeth. My presentation today will describe very briefly my doctoral study, which focused on the early level of curriculum for excellence and how the findings from my study influenced the content of realising the ambition being made. So I guess I wonder why the study was necessary. That might be a question you might ask. My literature review and my professional remit as an HMI highlighted a number of issues. These issues are that, sorry, you keep to the previous slide, thanks.
Sorry.
That children starting school experience periods of curriculum discontinuity across the early level. There are cultural differences also between ELC and primary school sectors, which include approaches to planning and pedagogy. And there's insignificant cognizance of the learning children bring with them into primary 1. My study at the time intended to explore those particular issues which I've just described. The question though is, one would think that the early level curriculum for excellence, which was designed to provide a broad range of continuous learning experiences for children aged 3 to 6 years age, that there should be such issues. So the provocation for today is, do policies and systems still get in the way of achieving curriculum continuity across the early level? A question we might explore in this session later on. In terms of impact, I would have to say I'm pleased that some of the findings from my study have influenced national guidance as seen in the content of the revised guidance for early years in Scotland. RTA has a dedicated section now on transitions, which offers more detailed guidance on what we can do to improve children's early primary school experience. It's great to see the 5 Cs already have been embraced by many already. And as I will hopefully demonstrate in the next couple of minutes, we will need to continue to influence transitions practice nationally whilst continuing to take cognizance of ongoing research. I have the next slide, Elizabeth. I'd like to say just a little bit about my doctoral study. It was an exploratory study which adopted qualitative methodology, and the data was generated through observations of a group of 13 children in their preschool year and into their primary 1 year. The data also came from semi-structured interviews with the child's parents, ELC practitioners and P1 teachers. The data was analysed using an adaptation of Braun and Clark's thematic analysis. 3 key themes emerged from that analysis. Firstly, that there are variations in the planning of the early level between ELC and early primary. Secondly, that the way in which parents support their children during that transition differs. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. I noted that parents changed perhaps the way that they operated with their children. And also, it was a little bit about how their agency changed. The third thing, which is really pertinent to what we're talking about today, is that children actually experience 2 versions of the early level. I call these traditions, an ELC tradition and a P1 tradition. And this third theme was the most influential in shaping sections of RTA. I concluded that as children move between these 2 traditions, they enter spaces which I conceptualise as contested and unified spaces. As children move between these 2 early level traditions, they hold transitory positions in both the spaces. So as practitioners and teachers and educators, we must recognise, though, that what positions agents, that's the child and the adult within a space, is a position of capital and power that is relevant to the purposes of a particular space. But how we support our children in these spaces is key to achieving a positive transition. Let me just say a little bit of how I conceptualise each of these spaces. The contested space combines the socio-cultural elements, the institutional cultures of the nursery or the school microsystem, which children might study inhabited. For me, it's where the ELC early level tradition loses its child-centeredness, its responsiveness, and its focus on play-based learning. The unified space, however, offers sameness and continuity. Some things look and feel familiar to children, and this can be viewed as a positive thing, as long as the continuity is high quality. The unified space offers choice. It empowers children to learn through play, and it allows children to influence the substance of the curriculum. It also opens up possibilities and opportunities for practitioners and teachers to bridge the 2 early level traditions. Can I go now to the last slide? Research rightly informs practice, and in turn, practice informs research. My findings have informed RTA, and I know that since I gathered my data, practice has moved on. Transitions across the early level have improved for some children. More practitioners and teachers recognise play is the best way for our youngest children to learn. They realise that the system must start with the child. We're not there yet, and I do think more research is needed. So, as children in transition navigate their way through the contested and unified spaces, we need to consider the 5 C's. I've underlined them in this final slide: child-centred, culture, communications, collaboration, and consistency. We need to conceive of ourselves as agents impelled by self-generated intentions, and as Bruner suggests, to see others in the same way. Agency and collaboration need to be treated in the same way. So to conclude, collaboration between actors has emerged as a key element of successfully bringing the early level traditions together. We must challenge the culturally imposed systems that exist. And in finding a meeting place, practitioners and primary 1 teachers need to continue, if they continue to perpetuate the contested space between the early level traditions across what Newman refers to as institutional barriers with culturally opposed expectations, then the curriculum for excellence early level, conceived by policymakers as a curriculum reform intent in developing continuity, is in danger of faltering. I'm now going to hand over to Aline-Wendy.
Thank you, Marion, for a really interesting presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed I can, Aline-Wendy.
Okay, great, so we're into that slide. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to talk about moving from a transitions longitudinal study to an integrative practice framework, as Elizabeth mentioned. But I want to share that journey because I think it explains better than anything why I've ended up with a framework. You could begin with the idea of how long is longitudinal study. And I read recently a piece of work by an American in a book of longitudinal studies work, who said that his study of young teenage parenthood took him 30 years as he followed through to new generations. I think the point is well made for the researcher studying transitions, because they're always going to be longitudinal in some way. And you must take account of the changing social, cultural, curriculum, policy imperatives that are going on at the time, and reflect on the work that you've achieved so far so that you can integrate the new findings into an emerging narrative. All transitions research, therefore, is going to be longitudinal. I don't think you would embark on it if you thought it would take as long as mine has. This presentation then draws from that study of one cohort's journey from the age of 3 to the age of 18 in Scotland. The study considered the contribution of transitions, well-being and attainment to eventual outcomes on school leaving. The study was framed really by a sort of hybridization of the third phase of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. So it became a socio-bio-ecological model. And that socio-cultural element is really important and cuts across our cries all the time of how we need to understand development. It needs to be much more socio-cultural in nature so that we don't get hooked into the inevitable deficits that seem to come by if we focus just on development. I used observation, interview, questionnaire, standardized measures, video tours, and documentation. And these were common through all stages of the research. But what emerged was a huge variability in school outcomes for the children, and that demands reflection on the relationships, personal attributes, the environments, including pedagogy, as potential explanatory factors. The study found that a good transition to primary and secondary school is definable, and you will see that in the slide, Elizabeth, if you could put it up, which contains quite a few of the results in terms of these titles of our presentation today: moving in, moving on, moving up, but also looks at person, process, context, and two particular outcomes, well-being and attainment, but for children, families, practitioners, and systems. So it's a complex web that you weave once you look at transitions. And it highlights the features at the foot of this slide of a good transition. Of course, it's a synopsis. So why use this term, transitions? There are so many changes in our lives. I think the term transitions brings them together, no more so than now. And there are opportunities and challenges in that as we continue in Scotland to have one of the youngest school entry ages globally. How best do we meet those changes for children and families? I think it's helpful to recognise that a number of changes can be occurring simultaneously. And it's helpful if we emphasise that and think about what Kagan introduced way back in 1991, the complexity of transitions as being both vertical and horizontal. And this is reflected in realising the ambition in the section on transitions. She brought a focus to continuity, and I want to come back to that in a minute as I rush through this. So these main findings in the first slide refer to the 150 children who went into 6 primary 1 classes in 4 different primary schools and then transitioned on to 6 secondary schools later in their educational career. I worked with them for 3 years in the first transition, popped in primary 3, worked with them again for 3 years in the secondary transition, and popped back in as they left school. And now I'm hoping to pop back in to meet them as adults. You see, you can't let go. So in amongst what's there in that first slide is the idea of good continuity. And Marion has referred to that. to continuity, I think it's really important to make the point that continuity can be all things. It may be good. If you have an excellent experience in nursery and primary one and they're well matched, that's a great, likely to be a great continuity. If you have the reverse, from a poor primary nursery setting to a poor primary with few opportunities, and they do exist, then that's much more problematic for children, because you still get continuity, but it's not quality. And of course, there are other permutations. So could we move to the next slide, please? I want just to show a couple of quick examples. Colin's is his well-being and attainment trajectory together over the period from nursery to senior one, and Katie's as well. And you can see that these don't necessarily sit absolutely equally, but in Colin's case, they do. His well-being wasn't, his attainment wasn't high relatively to the whole school population, you can see that, but it matches very closely with how he feels about himself. And Katie's does until she gets to primary 7, and then she does a massive dip. She's being bullied, and not their real names, of course. She's being bullied in primary 7. She can't wait to leave. And you can see how her well-being goes up. I think that's my time up, so I'll move quickly on to the last slide, please, which is where we then go, sorry, don't go back, but I also identified across the bottom of the previous slide 4 groups: the marginalized, the persevering, the getting by, and the doing well. And the children really go into those groups because of the transitions networks they have, the transitions readiness, not school readiness, transitions readiness they hold, and the transitions capital that builds from their ease in transitions. So I think this model, which puts collaboration, family engagement, children's agency, and competent systems together, informs what we need to do next. And I'm very happy to hand on to Kathleen, who's going to do a little bit about how that informs.
Thank you very much, Aline-Wendy. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so this afternoon, I'm hoping to be able to share with you our story from the Northern Alliance and how we have benefited greatly from working with Aline-Wendy and her research and the work that she has taken forward, and also the work of the Realising the Ambition and the work of Marion as well. So today we are going to look at the Northern Alliance's transition framework and how we have put research into practice. And why now? Well, I think the title shows it's very much about looking at transitions within the context of COVID-19 and reassuring colleagues that you know, at this time, we know about transitions. We have benefited from the work of Realising Ambitions and Realising Ambition and many other forms of research. But what are we going to take from that to really tell us what we need now? And also reminding colleagues of what those key elements are, and reminding one another that we have benefited from much of this work, and we understand what those core elements are. What do they look like now? Refreshing those core elements, reminding us and understanding what they look like within this context, and then renewing. What do we really need to refresh and renew in moving forward? Now that sounds fairly straightforward, but when we look at it within the context of a regional improvement collaborative, there are many different elements there. And there's a diagram there that shows that children and their families are right there at the centre, and then we've got these different elements that come in round about the outside. And indeed, that is great to see, but you can see that a RIC, a Regional Improvement Collaborative, is way out there on the outside. How do we make sure that what we can do and work with colleagues to make sure that we are able to support our children and families? And Marion talked about the importance of collaboration. And a Regional Improvement Collaborative at its heart is about collaboration. So collaborating to look at What do we need to do at this time? And when we developed our transitions framework, we looked at Aline-Wendy's transition and practice model, and we had the benefit of spending some time with Aline-Wendy to talk that through. We also looked at realising the ambitions and, of course, the 5 Cs. But there were other elements there, and indeed the very important side of what do we already know that works well within our own context, understanding very different contexts right across our 8 local authorities in the north of Scotland. Can we move on? Thank you. And so looking at our 4 elements, you'll recognise Aline-Wendy's 4 principles of transitions networks, transitions readiness, and as Aline-Wendy pointed out, it's not about school readiness, it's transition readiness, transitions capital, and transitions ease. And the different elements that sit in there, and within those, we don't have time to go into the details, but very much it's focusing on the child at the centre of that, really building up relationships with children and their families to understand what they can bring at this time to the process of transition, and what do they need from us as professionals, what do we need to be able to provide and work with and alongside. And when we look at networks, we're looking at not just the network of the child and the family, but the wider networks of professionals that may be engaged and involved in the life of the child, other practitioners, teachers, perhaps health visitors, moving on right through to secondary school. Also looking indeed at some of the tools that we already bring, because certainly within the Northern Alliance, we explored some tools such as emerging literacy, which is a key tool for us in our toolkit in looking at what a child brings in terms of their developmental progress, and a very much a developmental approach in developing their literacy, and working with Words Up, working with parents to look at language and helping children to be able to express how they feel. Also paths, promoting alternative thinking strategies, all these kind of tools that practitioners currently have in their toolkit. How are they using them? We're not starting from a blank page. How are we using them to support transitions at this particularly challenging time? And of course, well-being, very much important. The well-being of our children is at the heart, because if we don't have well-being, then how are children able to, and just as Aline-Wendy was able to exemplify in the run chart there. And good relationships build well-being. So that's the best start for transition, grounding effective transitions in positive relationships with our children and our families. So within our transitions framework, we obviously developed this 1-page diagram, which was great for people to engage with. But underneath that, we also included an outline of each principle and what that looked like at early level, at primary, and also at secondary, looking at that continuity and progression of experiences. Also, looking at sharing practice, what practice do we have that our people are currently taking forward that's working well? And also looking at examples of further reading, building on that research approach, practice informing research, informing practice. And then further on, reflective questions to support people to think about the transition process and how that might look within their own context. At the end, we had a framework that we believe was suitable for individual practitioners to consider their own transition processes, what that might look at school team level or ELC level, and also potentially for local authority teams. And you can see there on the slide, there is a link to the website, and you'll be able to access the framework from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen.
I think we've got one more slide.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. And I'll be very, very quick, I promise. At this point, we know that, just as we were saying, that systems and process, we can have systems and processes and all of those elements might be in place, but does it actually impact on what's happening to our children and families? And we can see from a recent report just published last week that there are still transitions as a real concern for parents, particularly parents with families with additional support needs, and those concerns that they have about those transitions to school and ELC. And so very much and very importantly, I'd like to just leave with that idea of going back to Marion's tweet. She said we must start with the child, and if the system is culturally opposed to that, then the system needs to change. How are we making sure that we are considering our children and our considering them, as it says in RTA, as an individual and within their environment and their surrounding culture? And then when we consider that, how are we using what our children are telling us, their interactions, their experiences, and the different spaces to help them to grow and develop for when we do move on into school and ELC, and how we're using that experiences. So I thought that would be quite a good way to leave, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Kathleen. And thank you to everybody else, to all of our speakers. That's been really great. I know you've been under a lot of pressure to whiz through what amounts to hours and hours, in some cases years of work there. But one of the things that we noticed and we talked about as a group when we were preparing the session today was the idea that obviously we're here under the umbrella of the Scottish Educational Research Association. So it was really relevant, we found, to see how questions from practice had driven the research that people were undertaking, and how that research had then underpinned the creation or the development of frameworks, policy and practice frameworks. And then we can see how that's moving in to new practices or evolving practices. And we're going to see the generation of new questions, and we're already seeing that coming out here in what Kathleen was saying there at the end. And I'm sure I can see, I'm getting the flickering light of the chat going. So I think we must have some questions coming up, and I'm sure that we've got lots of questions that you guys would like to put to our presenters, and that perhaps the presenters would like to ask of each other as well, I dare say. But I'm going to just move on quickly to a wee final slide that flags some things up. I'll bring that up again at the end, perhaps, because I think that it's better if I stop sharing my screen and that we can actually have this as a discussion, and that way I can see what's going on with the chat more easily as well to help facilitate the discussion. So let's have a look. Shad, is there anything that you've picked up on already that we could start with?
Yeah, thank you for your talks. I found that really interesting. I'm really interested because I don't know much about the Northern Irish context and how that's similar to the Scottish curriculum, and how you've used Aline-Wendy's research to inform your curriculum. I guess at the current moment, the question for all of you, transitions are so important given the COVID context and the coronavirus, and how are we really adapting, and how can we adapt given what we know from policy and the theory? We have these brilliant sort of models about transitions. It's really how can we put those into practice given the current context surrounding the return to schools and next academic year. So I have lots of questions going on in my head, but it's really how we apply these models in practice and learn from each other within the Irish context and the Scottish context.
Yep, go on, Aline-Wendy.
Thank you, everybody. I thought it was really interesting. I'd love it if people could put their cameras on. Are they able to? And then we can see them as well. If you feel like it, that would be great. You can join in more. We won't get everybody up on screen, I don't think. I think these are really good thoughts about how we make things work now in practice. And I love Kathleen's work with the Northern Alliance, not Northern Ireland, but Northern Alliance.
Oh, sorry.
No, just to be clear on it. And but I'm sure it would apply in Northern Ireland too. But I'm intrigued with the thought about how we can use networks. And I think in a lot of what we've heard, there's a real focus on working together. It's a kind of a national mantra at the moment as well. And somebody put up the question or the thought that maybe these transitions groups could go on all through the year. My unequivocal answer to that would be yes. Transitions are a process. I know a very good example from secondary education where a big high school actually begins the transition process with their primary schools when the children are in primary 5. By the time they come to primary 7, they've had all sorts of activities on campus at the secondary, and it's hugely familiar to them, and they have a very regular weekly visit to school during the last year of their primary education. I don't know that we, from nursery to primary, need those weekly visits, although I have seen that in practice during the summer term, and that also can be really, really effective. And I can't resist but say hello to Letitia's baby, who's with us on screen. So comments, what about, how about Kathleen? You would come in on that. Sorry, Elizabeth, you'll do that.
Go for it.
Absolutely. Networks, bread and butter of a regional improvement collaborative, coming together to understand and collaborate. We've been doing a lot of work on looking at what effective collaboration is, and when you bring people together, there's that risk of latent collaboration where you just come together and nothing real is as a result. And then there's that active collaboration where real innovation happens. Collaboration can lead to innovation, and when innovation happens, that's when exciting things happen. So coming together to look at how we can improve, how we can make a difference to our transitions processes, not just at the end of a year, but across that year. How are we improving them, and how are we listening to our children and our families as part of that process? I would agree, Aline-Wendy, definitely would support that kind of approach.
Marion, did you want to add anything? Still muted, yeah.
That's me, I'm unmuted. I think I'd like to pick up on something that, because I did race through my few minutes whilst I was helter-skeltering between my laptop, which crashed on me, to grab my iPad from one end of the house to the other, can I just say. Anyway, my study showed up quite a difference in terms of the variance between ELC and primary, which is why I talked about these culturally different traditions. You know, and picking up on the systems that exist, they're deeply embedded. You know, in the kind of systems in ELC that seem to me to be more responsive, to be more, at the time I did my study, I have to say, with the group that I worked with. And so I think we do have things that we still need to challenge around the cultures and the systems that exist between ELC and primary. Now, even in the one building, you know, you can have quite differences happening. And so how do we get over that? How do we challenge those norms? And much of it is because there's a lot of pressure, I think, in the primary side to achieve certain things, to reach certain milestones. And so the systems tend to drive what happens rather than the other way around. So if we're looking at an early level that is continuous, as it should be, then these two traditions, in my mind, shouldn't exist, because the early level spans 3 to 6. And if we only had the one ELC one early level tradition, then it would flow beautifully. And so those transitions, experiences could most naturally flow through. And so that's why I do think we need to think about how do we collaborate, one of the C's in the 5 C's, more effectively. And I put that back to folk about how they think they might do that. And it not necessarily lots of little transitions events throughout the year, but wholesale, get round the table, think about how we collaborate with each other to make sure that transition is effective.
I guess I'm not coming in with an answer for that, but I'd like to pick up on something that somebody had highlighted there about perhaps benefits, I wasn't sure the tone of the comment exactly, for private settings particularly. And thinking back to my own experience of working in the private sector, I recall a year where I had 19 children going to 17 different primary schools, leaving nursery. And so, you know, while we maybe had a couple of children going to some schools, there was a real diversity, and to manage well-supported transitions was a real challenge. And this was a number of years ago. So, you know, any thoughts on that, and ways, I guess, when we're thinking about networks, I don't know if there is this sense that if we have these better established ongoing networks, there's a role there. Aline-Wendy, hands up. You're muted.
Other way around, sorry. I think the network principle is a really interesting one to consider. It doesn't necessarily mean that for every 18 of the settings your children are going on to, you have to be in touch with each of them. But if there's an infrastructure where every primary school has a network with the nurseries from which children come, then we are networking. And that principle is there. So if one of your children happens to be going on to a different primary than the immediate network, still you would be confident that people network about the early learning and childcare experience with the primary one. And I think it is a dialogue. It's about knowing each other's practice. It's about building relationships. It's what Marion talked about agency for both early learning and childcare and children, and primary one staff, primary two staff, so that they can collaborate with each other. But the other element of what Bruna talked about was reflecting. And I think we need to reflect on what we're doing. And if we could do that collectively, then I think we also move to shift some of the issues that are coming. There's a couple of chat comments from Give Them Time. I recognize that they're from Give Them Time. We won't get this right for all children until we systematically work as if we belong to each other. And if early learning and childcare work with primary and vice versa without imposing, but arriving at negotiation of what's best for children. So we don't get top down. Of course, I always hope we might get some bottom up, but that's just where I'm oriented. And I think that's the way to begin to change systems, by working together. And that includes families.
Yeah. Yeah, and what Marion was talking about with the unified spaces, I think this idea of the network and the unified space, yeah? Laura G has raised her hand. What would you like to ask, Laura?
It wasn't so much asking something. I think it's really interesting to hear the different comments and different studies that have been done. I really hope that after all of the situation that we had with COVID, that people are, you know, more in the vein of having that collaboration, as Aline-Wendy speaking about there, between nursery and primary one, primary two. So I think it's hugely important, and we're seeing on other comments there people who have been working really closely, primary one staff with early year staff. So I just wanted to say that I really hope that that's something that from the situation we've been in, that we can actually take and move forward with.
Yeah. Yes, Kathleen, go on.
Certainly from my own experience and working with colleagues at local authority level, I've seen a couple of really nice examples of where collaboration is working, and it's when there is a real shared vision of what it is they want to achieve between ELC and primary one, not looking at it in two separate elements, just as Marion was saying, but that early level, that in the early level tradition, as Marion said, and having that shared vision and shared understanding of what it is want to achieve really helps, almost like a rationale for their network around what it is that they want to achieve in terms of the early level.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to jump back up because there was a question a wee bit earlier on if that's okay. Diane was asking about how we get decision makers and leaders in the local authorities to understand children's needs. Now, I think we've got some examples of some decision makers with us today. But what do you, any of the speakers like to comment on that? You know, how can we make this something that's happening more across the board? Perhaps there's a sense it's pockets of practice at the moment. In terms, this is particularly in terms of deferred funding or funding for deferred places, sorry. Anyone? Aline-Wendy? Well, Aline-Wendy first, and then we'll have Kathleen.
And yep. I think Anne Patterson's had her hand up a couple of times as well. I can see her. So at some point, Anne may want to come in too. I just find myself asking a question, and it's back to the provocation we put on Twitter about who changes, children or systems. Children are who they are. They're all growing up at different rates. Their development isn't linear, it moves sideways, things kick it and influence it, circumstances affect it. And apart from the movement that's called Give Them Time, I think we absolutely have to think, why are we rushing young children so much? We actually don't need to. And it's about this need, I think, for governments to prove their investments are working and to make a difference, particularly at the moment. And I worry about it because I think it's very stereotyping. Whilst I'm perfectly aware of the issue, I worry that we have a situation in which we're saying some children are going to be even more marginalized because of the COVID time. And people point the finger and they say, we know which families that is, and let's help the vulnerable families more, and let's invest in that. But we then go on doing exactly the same things that we've done my whole career. So we've got to do something differently. And what we've never done well is give children enough time. We're always putting in targets. We're always saying they've got to do this and that by the end of primary 1, something else by the end of primary 2. Some children, yes. Not all children. Some children, the penny doesn't drop until age 7 or 8. But if you give them that time without affecting their self-esteem as learners, then you have the opportunity that they will, with our support, reach the point that other children do as well. I sincerely believe that, and I think we can look at other models internationally that show us, for example, the Nordic countries, that although children start school generally later, by age 11, everybody is reading as fluently as any child in the United Kingdom. So why do we start here at 4.5 and in England at barely 4? I think there are huge issues there.
Thank you. Kathleen, you were going to add something?
I think all I was going to add in terms of looking at how we move forward is going back to how we began this presentation and making sure that in almost like a separate tier, that within the research informing practice, that we make sure that it's research informing policy as well, and that the practice then informs the policy and the research, so that it's very much clear that it's not something that's driven, policy driven, but practice driven and research driven. I think that's what we really need to make sure, and that's certainly the approach that we took within our transitions framework. You can see that woven right through it, there's evidence of realising the ambition, and also the 4 transition principles, because that's we wanted to make sure that our children and families were at the heart of that process.
Thank you. And Marion?
Yeah, if I could maybe just come in, I suppose it is about flying the flag here for realising the ambition. I mean, fundamentally, when we were looking at writing this as a kind of group of co-authors, and Lynn Taylor and Liz Patterson, who and others from around the country who've contributed, we really did start with the child, and that's where I suppose that provocation that I was mentioning, and right, and it is a provocation, that if we start with the child and be brave, I think, and a bit of risk taking here is to challenge those systems. I think we really do have to ask ourselves, who is it that matters most? And that's why we came up with the kind of the being me, and RTA talks of the voice of the child. So, we're talking about policy. For me, RTA almost is policy in many ways. It's driving what people are doing. And already we're seeing such a kind of a groundswell of change. And if I look at my, if you like, my research, how it's shifted since 2015 when I carried that out, to what's happening now. Play pedagogy is coming along very nicely, and folk are really taking that forward. And I think if we've got that, then those traditions that I talked about, ELC tradition and the primary one tradition for the early level, that unified space is really coming together. And that kind of transitory moment, I think, into the contested space is disappearing.
Thanks. Now, Anne Patterson, you had a question as well, is that right, or a comment?
I suppose it's a bit of both, really. I liked right at the beginning when Marion had mentioned around the parents changing and their agency in this, and perhaps the time we're in just now, we have the opportunity to actually work with our parents and their understanding of play. I suppose I am one of these bad people in local authority that makes policy, and I have seen some excellent, and I absolutely mean excellent, work with parents during this period, and not firing out worksheets, not firing out things, but actually teachers really working with the early years families about what is good play, and such fantastic video clips coming back. But also in some situations, parents have written to me as well and have said they have realised that important relationship with their child's teacher, and that has really been something that they valued. Now, out of all of this that we've come through, surely that's a positive, and it's a positive exactly in everything we've been talking about today with transition and with realising the ambition. And I'm so glad we've gone back to saying realising the ambition as opposed to RTA, because that sounds like a road traffic accident, which it certainly isn't. So, I think that we have real possibilities just now, and it's exciting. And I think, that we should really grab them.
Thanks, Anne. There's definitely been a theme in the comments that I'm seeing about, the opportunities of the current moment, the possibility for challenge and change. There does seem to be a kind of momentum building for some of this as well. Because I see a comment from Brenda there about, was it to do with, Brenda, would you like to express your question or your comment that you had there?
Hi there. I think it is just more that we need to take this beyond the education channels that we're having these discussions in, and actually maybe make this a bigger societal conversation that's needed. I think, while parents may be quite happy to hear what their individual school are doing for their child, as soon as they hear perhaps what their neighbour's child or their friend's child's doing, then they start to worry that things need to be done that way for themselves. And I think we need to be getting the conversations out much better about what children and childhood is and what's important to them. So I suppose it's not really a question, it was just an observation.
No, that idea of comparison, that people make comparisons with what they see, that's something that's been echoed, I feel, in news stories I've seen as well. Aline-Wendy, you wanted to come in there.
This comes from my research as well, but it's probably a belief of mine about the role of parents in all of this. We're talking about activating parents, we're talking about what we can do, but in fact, I think it's really important we do this together with parents. We're too good as teachers in education at telling. And I think we need to learn to collaborate and to listen. And we will get great results from that, because what that also does is increase parental agency and confidence that they're going to be heard in the system. It's about what we now call voice. And I'm sure there's lots of good practice, there's lots of ways that people do that, but it's not something that's well addressed any more than play is in initial teacher education. It's better addressed in early years, early learning and childcare preparation, but it's absolutely a quality that we need in the teaching profession all the way through. Parents in my study, I looked at the kind of topography of how they engage with education and support their children, and they model, they instruct, they offer advice, they encourage, and they often do that incredibly well, but are having many times to do it independently of the school that their child attends, instead of doing it collaboratively with the school their child attends. And I think we get the buy-in to play as well if we actually share what it is that play does. We need to be clever at sharing what play looks like in primary one and what's going on. Long ago in a study, I had parents saying, wish I could be a fly on the wall, as their local primary introduced play in primary one and primary two. They wanted to see, and it's feeling you're part of something. That participation means that as a parent you can contribute. Instead of just responding to the school agenda, you can feel you might be influencing it in some way. I think it's at the bottom of our systems being unable to get it right for all children, because we're not yet actually collaborating fully with families. And I don't deny that there's good practice, but I think it's something we could both do better in research, in practice, and in the education of our practitioners and teachers.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, I did notice in the chat there, Anne putting up a post about, celebrating some of the really good work that's going on in terms of play. And if I'm following through Twitter, some of the things that people are sharing with us around taking the section on play, which we also elaborated in Realising the Ambition, but similarly in terms of curriculum, there's a lot of really good work there that can be shared. And I know that we're capturing it in wakelets on Education Scotland's early years sites, but also other authorities are collating some of that, and it's really great that they're sharing it, and the more we can do that and get that out there, the better. So Lynn Taylor's the kind of go-to person for sending these things, because she really, that's her job, if you like. She's pulling all that together as an education officer, supported by Shan Neil. So anything that people are working with and want to share, it's just fantastic, some of the things that we're seeing. It's so heartening. But, and it's reaching, as Aline-Wendy says, it's reaching out and empowering parents. And that was the thing that struck me, that, that shift from being a parent of a nursery child, where it was reciprocal, the relationships were so responsive, and yet something was happening to that same parent as they moved into P1. It was almost the hold them at the gate kind of stuff. And we need to challenge that. And the more we do it, the more parents will understand what we mean by play pedagogy, and what we mean by working together to understand the voice of the child. So parents have their role to play too. And the language that they use as their child becomes a primary one. So we need to be pushing against that too. So there's some great stuff out there, and yes, we should celebrate it, Anne.
Thank you. I'd like to just pick up on that idea about the language that we use. I was thinking about a comment or a tweet I think I saw from a colleague recently who's particularly works with able children, and she was talking about that language we use sometimes, and I'm thinking here about to the point about deferring children as well, of holding children back. And I think that actually, yeah, Marion's shaking her head there, but you know, with all of this, there's a sense that by changing the language that we use, when we talk about collaboration and when we talk about parents as partners within that, and when we talk about the way that we view children, that helps us change the system, I feel. That we have to start by telling it the way we want it to be, almost. Does that sound like something that fits? And a lot of what I see in Realising the Ambition is the terminology. It's about how we express the ideas, how we, if you like, sell parents and society on the fact that this is right. This is the way that things should be. It's not a fad. It's not something that's bad for their children. It's something that's right, and it's something that we should all be moving towards together. Perhaps a bit of a gut reaction there, but I feel that the language is something that just always comes back.
Yeah, I'd like to hear what Diane has got her hand up, Elizabeth. So I'm not sure.
Sorry, Diane, I can't see all the hands very easily with so many small pictures. Sorry, thanks, Diane.
No, that's okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just thought I was going to start typing a response. It's probably too long of an answer, but I just sat this morning typing up my discussion chapter for my dissertation that I'm doing for my Masters in Public Health, which is focusing on the kind of wellbeing impacts of transition to children going to primary 1 at age 4. And I've got a big list of words that have been used, the language used. Now, this has all come from parents. But the language that's used actually, when you say it's a societal attitude, and that's what I've written in my dissertation, but a lot of this language actually comes from professionals as well. So when parents are asking for advice and support, and I'm a member of the Give, Ben 10 campaign, so obviously I'm campaigning for funding for all deferrals, so all my experience is about that. But when parents are asking early years practitioners for advice, this language comes back to them, about don't hold them back, and they're going to be bored. I mean, we can't meet their needs here, and all this sort of thing. So I do agree. I mean, there's a wider societal expectation in Scotland that children go to school at 4, and all the stats show that that's what happens. But the parents that I interviewed were basically terrified of their child being labelled, and there was all this stigma and shame attached to it, but it was a wider societal thing, so I couldn't say, I didn't quantify who said it most, but there was a spectrum of who it came from, and there was one of my overarching themes that I'll be reporting on is the role of the early years practitioner in making sure that those labels and that sort of attitude is squashed at that point, and they're in a prime position to do that. How we tackle the wider societal thing, I think the Scottish Government have agreed to fund all deferrals in the future, and who knows when that will come. But until that happens, I think we really need to actively try and pursue this, and I think early years practitioners are in a brilliant position to do it.
Thanks, Diane. Anybody from any presenters like to comment on what Diane was saying? Aline-Wendy?
I'm absolutely bound to, I think. I think you're absolutely right about the language used. We all have to be mindful of that, Diane, and everybody. I think that's really what I was referring to when my presentation, I sidetracked myself, despite my notes, to say that I thought we needed a different model of development. It absolutely hits me all the time. We argue that we need to know all about child development, and we absolutely do professionally, whatever the age of child we're working with, because it alerts us in lots of ways to if there are needs, if a child is exceptional in an area or whatever. But development isn't, as I said, isn't linear. It's not just milestones. It's about people, it's about relationships, it's about moving across interests, it's about being able to express yourself. It depends what model you follow, like Elizabeth said. Is it a linear, medical, even Piagetian kind of model, or is it one where you see the child as part of the family and society? and you understand the child in the round, which is what we're trying to do. I mean, GERFEC's all about that. But how well do we do it? We've got all the right tools, but we need to be using them and to be considering, what is our model of the child? Is your model of the child as somebody creative and competent, who has agency, or do you shut that down? And equally, do you do that with their families? Professionalism is about holding knowledge, but it's also, I think, about sharing that. And we need to be able to share constructively on our vision of childhood, I think, to be something that is very positive, that isn't about holding back or sending on or missing a stage, but is about getting it right at the time. So the kind of statement about, oh, they need to go on to school because they're finished here, or in primary 7, I think it was a primary 7 child said to me, I think you'll find that we've all matured beyond primary 7 now. And yet another child says, I ought to be in primary 6. I always thought I should be with over the cusp the other way. And he was a champion who had got through to senior 1 with dyslexia, but hugely damaging to self-esteem. So, and that's the well-being thing. So I think we really, really do need to reflect on how we see children and respect they're not our children. They're children who are part of families. And I'm getting off on, you know, beliefs, but I think they're there. I think they're underpinned by the knowledge we have. And as Kathleen said, it can begin in practice, it goes into research, and research takes us back again into practice. It's a kind of virtual cycle where we hook in the theory as well, so we understand what we're doing. And
that's 5 o'clock. So we're going to have to bring this discussion to an end. Thank you all very much for joining us. I think I'm not going to add any last words. I think we've had some last words there that actually sum up a lot of the issues that we've discussed. There seems to be a lot of motivation for change, but perhaps these, you know, here we have the people who are already keen, so we need to get out there, let's spread the word, let's change society, let's get parents collaborating with us. What do we have to lose? We have everything to play for at the moment. It does seem like a fantastic opportunity. So thank you all very, very much for joining us at our SERA Connects event. As just before we leave, I will share again the final slide that has details of our SERA Facebook address and Twitter, as well as that you can access the recording on the SERA Connects page of the SERA website. If you Google it, it will turn up. And they have a YouTube channel that it will be linked to. So I would just share the screen again, if I can. Those are our details. Thank you all very much for coming. Now we can't wait for bye. Put those up for a minute. And we have, another event coming up in October. So please see our Twitter feed and join us in October to talk about digital play as well. That's an early years network event rather than SERA Connects, but there'll be more SERA Connects to come. Angela, did you want to say anything to close?
Thank you very much for a fantastic event and hopefully see another SERA event soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.